The gravel lot was already burning at 6 in the morning. Not warm. Burning. The kind of heat that soaks through boot leather and makes the backs of knees sweat before a single order has been given. Fort Jackson, South Carolina, in the first week of August, does not ease anyone into anything. It simply arrives, all at once, like a wall you walk into without seeing it coming. 400 recruits stood in 6 long rows. Their newly issued uniforms were still stiff at the collar, still carrying the warehouse smell they had come in, and their faces held the particular expression of people who have been awake since 4 in the morning and have learned, in 72 hours, not to let that show. They had been on base for exactly 3 days, long enough to know where the latrines were, long enough to know they were not supposed to speak unless spoken to, not long enough to know anything that actually mattered about what was coming. At the front of the formation, Drill Sergeant Marcus Webb moved the way men move when they have done something so many times that the movement itself becomes a kind of language. He did not pace, he traveled. His boots came down with a specific weight that recruits felt in their chests before they heard it with their ears, and the silence he carried around him was the kind of silence that a crowd produces when it is collectively holding its breath and is not sure when it will be allowed to let it go. He had been doing this for 11 years. 11 August summers on this gravel. He had trained mechanics and nurses and boys from farming towns in Nebraska who had never been more than 40 miles from the house they were born in. He had trained daughters of military families who already knew how to fold a shirt properly, and sons of men who had told them the army would fix whatever was wrong with them. He had trained young people who arrived angry, and young people who arrived terrified, and young people who arrived with an expression of determined blankness, as if they had decided before stepping off the bus that they would not let this place see anything it could use against them. He knew all of those types. He knew what they needed and how to reach them, and how to make them into something the Army could use. In 11 years, not one recruit had stepped out of rank to address him directly. That was about to change. In the 4th row, 3rd position from the left, stood a 19-year-old named Alicia Renner. She was not remarkable to look at in the way that draws immediate attention. Average height, slight build, dark hair pulled back under her cover with the mechanical tidiness that new recruits learn in the first hour on base. She had been a safety officer's assistant at a civilian contracting firm for 2 years before enlisting, which meant she had spent 2 years reading regulation documents the way other people read novels. Carefully, patiently, with retention. She had a mind that collected specific numbers and procedural sequences the way other people collect grievances, and she had walked onto this base with a notebook already full of regulations she had memorized voluntarily, for reasons that had nothing to do with impressing anyone, and everything to do with the fact that she found clear rules in complex situations to be, in some fundamental way, a comfort. She had noticed the violation on the first day. She said nothing on the first day because she told herself she had misread the situation. She was new here, he was not. There were 400 people in this formation, and not one of them was frowning at what she was frowning at, which suggested the problem might be with her reading, and not with what she was reading. She decided to watch again before drawing a conclusion. She was not wrong. On the second morning she watched it again, and this time she cross-referenced it in her mind against the language of Army Regulation 385-10, with the involuntary precision of someone who cannot help but notice when a rule is broken, the way a musician cannot help but hear a wrong note in a chord, even when every other instrument is playing correctly. The regulation was clear. The protocol was specific. What Webb was doing with the equipment stored in Staging Area 7 was a Category B safety deviation, not catastrophic, not immediately dangerous to anyone standing in the lot that morning, but cumulative, the kind of deviation that compounds quietly in the background and does not matter until the single morning it matters enormously, and by then it is always too late to point to the mornings before it. She looked for a reporting form that night. The form existed. The process for submitting it to a ranking officer during an active training cycle was designed in a way that guaranteed it would reach no one with the authority to act on it for at least 2 weeks. 2 weeks. The training cycle was 4 weeks long. Half of it would be behind her before anything moved through the right channels. She read the process twice, and then sat with her notebook open in her lap, and thought about what that meant and what she was going to do about it. On the morning of the 3rd day, Webb moved toward the equipment again. Alicia Renner stepped out of rank. She did not run. She did not raise her hand like someone requesting permission. She walked, with controlled and deliberate steps, out of the fourth row and into the open space between the formation and the front of the lot, where no recruit was supposed to be standing unless they had been called there for a reason that was about to ruin their entire morning. The sound her boots made crossing that gravel was, for the 4 seconds it took her to cover the distance, the only sound on the lot that was not the ambient hum of heat and the distant noise of the bass going about its other business. 399 people stopped breathing. Webb heard the footsteps. He turned. His face did the thing faces do when they encounter something they have never been required to process before. It did almost nothing at all, which was somehow more alarming than anger would have been. There was a stillness in his expression that was the stillness of a person rapidly and carefully calculating what exactly they are looking at and what category it belongs to. He looked at her. She looked at him. The Georgia sun was already at the level where it makes the air above gravel ripple like the surface of still water, and in the heat and the silence and the weight of 400 people watching, without appearing to watch, Alicia Renner opened her mouth and spoke. She spoke in the flat, specific language of Army safety protocol. Not a question, not an accusation. A statement of observed fact, delivered in the institutional voice she had learned from 2 years of sitting beside a compliance officer who believed that clean and unemotional language was the hardest language in the world to argue against, because it left nothing personal to push back on. You could argue with a person. You could not argue with a regulation cited correctly. She cited the regulation by number. She described the deviation in terms that were precise and brief, the way a weather report is brief, not because the subject is simple, but because specificity serves better than elaboration. She stated that she was using the formal verbal invocation that AR 385-10 assigns to personnel who observe a continuing safety risk and have been unable to resolve it through the standard reporting channels within the time frame available. Then she said the phrase, "I am formally requesting that you walk away from that equipment now, drill sergeant." The silence that followed was not empty. It had texture and temperature. It was the kind of silence that forms when 400 people simultaneously understand that what they are witnessing is not a mistake, and not a breakdown, and not a recruit having a moment of very poor judgment. It was something else. Something they did not yet have a word for, but recognized in the body the way you recognize something true even before your mind has processed it into language. Webb did not move. He stood in the morning heat, with 11 years of mornings sitting on his face, and he looked at the 19-year-old in front of him with an expression that crossed through several different territories before settling somewhere that none of the recruits watching could quite name or describe afterward without disagreeing about it. One of them, a 22-year-old from Tulsa named Gary Oakes, would describe it 7 years later in a letter he submitted to a military ethics journal. He wrote that it looked, for just a moment, like recognition, like Webb was looking at something he had not expected to find here, on this gravel lot, on this ordinary Thursday morning in August, and was not entirely sure what to do with having found it. Gary wrote that it was not the look of a man who had been challenged, it was the look of a man who had been seen. Nobody moved. The heat pressed down on all of them equally. And then Marcus Webb, drill sergeant, 11-year veteran of basic combat training at Fort Jackson, took one deliberate step to his left, away from the equipment. He did not explain it. He did not explain it. He did not acknowledge her formally, or cite the regulation back to her, or make any kind of visible performance of the decision he had just made. He simply moved one step to the left. Then he continued with the morning's training schedule, as if the last 43 seconds had not occurred on this gravel in front of everyone. But they had. Every person on that lot knew they had. Alicia Renner returned to her position in the fourth row. She did not look around to check who was watching. She faced forward, adjusted her cover, and stood at attention with the same posture she had held an hour ago, and the hour before that. From 6 feet to her left, a recruit named Helen Ford stared straight ahead and said nothing at all. But her hand, which had been hanging at her side in the standard position, moved exactly 3 inches to the right until her knuckle barely touched Renner's. It lasted less than a second. Renner did not look over. She did not need to. They stood in the Georgia heat, all 400 of them, and the morning moved forward the way mornings move, when something inside them has shifted that no one has named yet, but everyone has felt. The way the air changes before weather arrives, quietly and in the body, before the mind has found the right word for what it is sensing. What had just happened was not dramatic in the way the word dramatic is usually used. There was no raised voice, no confrontation in the way films show confrontations, no shaking fist, no moment of visible emotion from either of the two people at the center of it. The whole exchange had lasted less than a minute, and it had taken place in a specialized language that most of the recruits present only half understood. But they understood the shape of it. They understood that a person could be 19 years old, and standing in a place specifically designed by people who had thought very carefully about this, to teach her that her individual judgment did not yet count for anything, and she could look at that design and look at the thing that was wrong in front of her, and make a calculation, in real time, under pressure, about which one of those two things was going to determine what she did in the next 4 seconds. And they understood, in the particular way that young people understand things they do not yet have the vocabulary for, that the answer she had chosen was not the safe one. It was just the right one. Webb ran the remainder of that morning with the same precise efficiency that had made him one of the most effective trainers on the post. He did not reference what had happened. He did not make Renner stand out in any way, or assign her additional duties, or give her the kind of long, meaningful look across a formation that a person in his position could easily have deployed to communicate something that the regulations would not allow him to say out loud. What he did, which nobody consciously noticed until much later when several of the recruits sat down and compared their memories of that morning, was spend the rest of the session running the equipment protocol strictly by the book. Every single step, every checklist item in its proper sequence, the way the regulations said it was supposed to be done, and the way, for 3 consecutive mornings before this one, it had not been done. 400 recruits watched him do it. They said nothing about that either. But Gary Oakes, from Tulsa, would later write in that letter that you could feel something move through the formation that morning, like a current moving through a wire that you cannot see, invisible, but entirely real. The particular feeling of watching a person discover, in front of everyone, that a 19-year-old with a memorized regulation knows exactly what she is doing, and that knowing it clearly and stating it out loud is not the same thing as being wrong. He wrote that it was one of the most educational moments of his time in uniform, and that none of it appeared in any training manual he had ever read. The morning ended. The recruits were dismissed to their next scheduled activity. Alicia Renner walked across the gravel with the rest of them, boot to boot, in the August heat, carrying the thing that had just happened in the place inside her chest where she kept things she did not yet know the full weight of. She would not know it for years. None of them would. But it had started. Right there, on the gravel, in the heat, in the 3rd minute past 6 on a Thursday morning in August, in the year 2007. Something had started that would take years to fully arrive. The days after moved in the compressed, repetitive rhythm that basic combat training is specifically designed to create. Up before the sun every morning, formation in the dark, physical training, instruction in the heat of the day, meals eaten in focused silence, lights out, begin again. The rhythm was not accidental, it was the point. The Army understands that repetition, sustained over enough days, rewrites a person at the level where decisions are made before the thinking part of the brain has had time to weigh in. That is what they are building, people who act correctly before they decide to. Within that rhythm, Alicia Renner and Marcus Webb did not speak outside the structured language of training. He gave orders. She followed them with the same precision she brought to everything she decided to take seriously, which was clean and economical and complete. From the outside, looking at either of them during any given hour of any given training day, nothing had changed between the first morning and the days that came after. From the inside, everything had changed. Not in ways that showed in behavior, or performance, or any measurable output that the Army had forms to capture. But the 43 seconds on the gravel lot had done something to the air of the training environment that every recruit present felt without being able to name. The way a room feels different after a window has been opened, even after that window has been closed again. Something had moved through. The space was not the same shape it had been before. The recruits talked about it in the careful quiet that forms in barracks after lights out, when people are too wound up to sleep, but too exhausted to do anything except lie still, and let their minds work through what the day has left in them. Helen Ford, who had been a nursing student in Charlotte before enlisting and who had a gift for taking complicated things apart into understandable pieces, told the bunk above her that the part she kept returning to was the phrase, not the action of stepping out, not what happened afterward, the phrase itself. She said there was a specific difference between someone saying, "You are doing this wrong," and someone saying, "I am formally invoking the protocol that exists for exactly this situation, and I am doing so correctly and by the book." She said the first one was personal. It was an opinion, even if the opinion was correct. The second one was structural. It was the rules themselves agreeing with the person using them, which meant you could not separate the invocation from the institution that created it. You could dismiss a person, you could not dismiss the institution the person was citing, and Webb could not dismiss her without dismissing the regulation, which he could not do on a lot with 400 witnesses without consequences that would follow him. Helen said all of that quietly, in the dark, to the bunk above her, and then was quiet herself for a moment. Then she said, she prepared for that. She knew exactly what she was doing when she chose that phrase. In the bunk above, a recruit named Patrick Lowe's said yes, that was all right. But the part sitting with him was different. His part was the step away. Not that it happened, but how it happened. Without explanation, without acknowledgement, without Webb making any kind of visible effort to frame the step in a way that made it look like something other than what it was. He said he had been watching for some sign that Webb was going to qualify it somehow, make it look procedural rather than chosen, and Webb had not done that. He had simply stepped away and moved on, and Patrick said there was a kind of dignity in that which had surprised him. He had not expected to use the word dignity in connection with anything that happened on this lot. He said he was still working out what to do with having thought it. Neither of them knew that 3 rows over, in a lower bunk near the east wall, Alicia Renner was not asleep. She was on her back with her hands folded on her stomach in the dark, doing the thing she had done since childhood when she was working something out, which was to replay it in precise sequential order from beginning to end. The way you replay footage you are studying for a specific detail you have not yet identified. She was replaying the 3 seconds before she stepped out. Not the step itself, not the phrase or the exchange or the step away or the rest of the morning. The 3 seconds before. In those 3 seconds she had known exactly, and without ambiguity, what she was risking. She had been on base for 72 hours. She had no standing, no seniority, no institutional weight of any kind. She was inside a system that had been carefully and deliberately engineered to teach her that her individual judgment was less reliable than the judgment of the person above her in the chain of command. That was not a flaw in the system. It was a deliberate feature, built in by people who had thought about it seriously, because soldiers who question commands in active situations are dangerous, and the only way to remove that danger is to make the cost of second-guessing very high, and very immediate, and very consistent. She had known all of that before she got on the bus that brought her to Fort Jackson, and in those 3 seconds she had done the accounting in the flat, deliberate way she processed risk when it mattered, as a set of variables to be weighed, rather than as a feeling to be navigated. On one side of the ledger, what she stood to lose by staying silent. A Category B deviation, cumulative risk, equipment handled incorrectly for a 3rd consecutive morning by the person responsible for 400 people. Not catastrophic in isolation, not immediately dangerous to anyone present that morning, but the kind of thing that compounds in the background and does not announce itself before the moment it stops being background. On the other side, everything else. Everything else was real, and it was heavy, and she was honest with herself, in those 3 seconds, about how heavy it was. She was new. He was not. The system was not on her side in any visible way. The outcome was not predictable. The range of possible responses from a drill sergeant confronted publicly by a recruit who had stepped out of rank ranged from complicated to very complicated, and none of the versions she ran through in those 3 seconds ended simply. She held both sides in her mind. She held them for 3 seconds. Then she stepped out. Not because the first side had clearly outweighed the second, not because the numbers had come out in one direction so strongly that the choice felt obvious. The choice had not felt obvious. The choice had felt like a choice, which meant both sides were real and both carried weight. She stepped out because she had looked at the version of herself that stayed in the fourth row, that absorbed the deviation and stood still and said nothing. And she had thought, I am going to carry something through the rest of this training cycle, no matter what I do. If I step out and it goes badly, I carry that. But if I stay still, I carry the other thing. I carry the knowledge that I saw it and I had the regulation, and I had the phrase, and I stood there and did nothing with any of it. She did not want to carry the second kind. That was the entirety of her reasoning. It was not heroic in any meaning of that word she recognized or would have claimed. It was closer to a preference. She had a preference for the particular weight that comes from doing the thing you know is correct, even when correct and comfortable are not the same address. She had not expected Webb to step away. She wanted to be clear with herself about that, lying in the bunk in the dark. She had prepared for an exchange. She had the regulation memorized in sufficient depth that she could have sustained a formal and specific conversation about it for several minutes without running out of citable material. She had been ready for that. She had not prepared for him to simply move. And she found, turning this over in the dark, that his doing it without explanation and without performance was sitting in a place inside her that she did not have a clean word for. Not a soft place, a complicated one. The kind of place where things sit when they do not fit neatly into any of the categories you have available. She had decided, in the 3 seconds before stepping out, that his response was not the variable she was solving for. She was solving for her own behavior. What he did afterward belonged to him. She had then gone and acted on that decision, and he had responded in the one way she had not included in any of the versions she had run in her mind. She decided, in the dark, that she would do nothing with that. That the two things were separate, her action and his response. She was responsible for hers. His response was his. She closed her eyes. She slept. 4 days later, the training cycle entered its second phase, and the structure of the days changed. Less classroom, more field, more variables, more movement, more real-time judgment required from everyone involved. Webb remained the primary instructor, but the fixed rhythm of the gravel lot gave way to something less predictable and more demanding. It was on the second day of field exercises that the morning began to go wrong in the slow, invisible way that mornings go wrong, when no single thing is enough to trigger alarm, but the combination of several ordinary things adds up to something that is not ordinary at all. The heat that morning had reached the level where it stops being weather and becomes a condition you move through, rather than something happening around you. The training schedule was running behind because of a supply delivery that had not arrived when it was supposed to, and the adjustment to the schedule had been communicated imperfectly down the chain, so people were in the wrong places at the wrong times and the patchwork was showing. Webb had been on post since 4:30 and had not eaten since the previous evening, and would not have mentioned either of those facts if someone had directly asked him, because they were not the kind of facts he considered relevant to share. He was leading the column through a ground navigation exercise in the woodline east of the main lot. Compass work, terrain reading, the skill of understanding where you are when the visible markers you normally rely on have been stripped away. This was one of his strongest teaching areas. He had walked this specific woodline dozens of times in different kinds of light and at different hours, and knew its terrain the way you know a place you have needed to understand, rather than simply moved through. He was in the middle of an instruction about a terrain feature on the eastern slope when Daniel Carr noticed it. Daniel was a 20-year-old from Columbus, Ohio, who had spent 3 years working overnight shifts at a hospital before enlisting, which had given him a particular sensitivity to subtle changes in people's physical presentation. He noticed that Webb's speech had slowed in a way that did not match the deliberate pacing of his normal instruction. A small change. The kind of thing a person could explain as emphasis, as a pause for effect. Daniel noted it without yet forming a sentence around what he had noted, the way the body registers information before the mind has organized it into language. 3 minutes later, Webb stopped walking. He had been moving the column at a consistent pace, and then he was standing still. His right hand was flat against the side of a pine tree, not in the posture of a person who has stopped to point something out, in the posture of a person who has found the nearest solid object, and the need to hold on to something solid has become, without warning and without apparent transition, the most important thing in the immediate situation. Daniel Carr saw it. Helen Ford saw it. Alicia Renner, 4 recruits back in the column and slightly offset to the right, saw it. And in the moment she saw it, everything else cleared from her mind, with the completeness of water clearing from a surface, leaving behind only the specific vocabulary of what she was looking at and what it required. She moved up the column at a pace that was not running, but was emphatically not walking either, the kind of controlled and deliberate movement that does not waste time. She came up on Webb's right side. She did not touch him. She positioned herself at the distance from which she could catch him if catching became necessary, and she spoke in the same flat and specific voice she had used 4 days ago on the gravel lot, the voice that stripped everything personal out of a communication and left only the information it needed to carry. She said she was asking him to sit down, right now, here, on the ground. There was no question in it. He turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were working harder than they should have needed to work to focus on her face, which told her everything she needed to know about the state of the situation. She had studied enough first aid to read what she was looking at, and what she was reading told her that the next 60 seconds were the variable that mattered more than all the other variables in the woodline combined. "Drill sergeant," she said. "Sit down now." He sat down. Not as a considered decision made by a person in full command of the situation. His body made the decision for the part of him that was still trying to maintain the appearance of being in command, and the part trying to maintain the appearance did not have enough left to resist. He went down against the base of the pine tree, knees first, and then the rest of him, and the sound it made was the loudest sound the woodline had held all morning. Renner was already talking to Sophie Grant, the recruit nearest her on the left, giving her specific instructions in the order they needed to happen. Water, the location of the medic station on the eastern boundary, the coordinate she had noted on her compass when the column entered the woodline. Sophie was in motion before the sentence was complete. Renner turned back to Webb. He was conscious. His eyes tracked her when she moved. But the color had left his face in the direction color goes when the body is managing something larger than its available resources. And both his hands were pressed flat against the pine needles and the earth beside the tree, fingers spread and pressing down, the way hands press into the ground when a person is trying to stay attached to the surface they are on. She knelt beside him. She did not use the institutional voice. Not here. Not for this. She used the other voice, the one underneath all her training and her language and her careful regulation vocabulary, the one that was simply her. She said his name. Not his rank. Not Drill Sergeant Webb, the way all 270 hours of training she had received told her to address him. His first name. "Marcus," she said. "I have this. You can stay right there." 399 recruits stood in the pine-shadowed woodline and watched. Not the way they had watched 4 days ago on the gravel lot, where the watching had been a held-breath thing, sideways and careful, 400 people trying to witness something while appearing not to witness it. This was different. This was the watching that happens when something too real for any kind of performance is occurring in front of you, and the only honest response available is to stop pretending you are somewhere else. They watched Alicia Renner kneeling in the pine needles beside the man who had been the loudest and most demanding presence in their world for the last 8 days. One hand held close enough to catch him if he needed catching, her voice steady, her posture without any quality of urgency or alarm, because she had discovered at some point in her 19 years that the thing a person in a crisis most needs from the person next to them is for that person to seem, above everything else, unhurried. Not because she was unhurried inside. She would say, 15 years later, that she was afraid in the way she was always afraid, in moments that required her complete presence, not in her voice and not in her hands, but somewhere deeper and quieter, in the part where fear lives, when a person has decided that fear does not have the authority to make any decisions today. Sophie Grant returned with the medic in 11 minutes. To everyone in the woodline, those 11 minutes felt considerably longer than 11 minutes. Webb was treated in the field first. Assessment, stabilization, the immediate interventions for what was clearly heat exhaustion, compounded by dehydration, and the kind of fatigue that builds in a person who operates at full capacity, for long enough without adequate rest or food. He was then transported to the post-medical facility. He would return to duty in 2 days. He would complete the training cycle. But what had happened in those 11 minutes in the woodline, the kneeling and the steady voice, and the name, said without the rank attached to it, would stay in the people who were present in the way that real things stay, not as a memory retrieved deliberately, but as something that alters the shape of what you understand is possible in another person. 4 days before, Renner had stepped out of a formation and cited a regulation at a person with every institutional advantage over her. Now she was in the pine needles, keeping her voice even, telling that same person she had it and he could stay. 2 moments. The same essential thing underneath both of them. Sophie Grant stood at the edge of the group while the medic worked and watched Alicia Renner stand up from the ground and brush the dirt from her knees with 2 quiet, unhurried movements, and thought about what she had initially assumed when she watched this same person cross the gravel lot 4 days ago. She had thought, in that moment, that she was watching someone who had not fully thought through what she was doing. She knew better now. The medic gave the recruits instructions for the remainder of the morning. Alicia Renner looked at her compass and took a bearing and told the column, in a voice that reached the back of the group without needing to be raised, that they had 2 terrain features still to cover before the midday assembly, and they should move. They moved. The Army does not record everything. This is not a criticism of the Army. It is simply the nature of institutions that are designed to process large numbers of people through standardized systems, with consistency and accountability. The things that get recorded are the things the forms are designed to capture: performance assessments, medical events, formal conduct citations, training completion records, commendations issued through the proper channels. These are real and important records. They tell the story of what the institution measured and what it decided mattered enough to track. They do not tell the story of everything that matters. The things that happen between those forms, the moments that do not have a corresponding field in any database, move through institutions differently. They move the way water moves through rock, slowly, without announcement, leaving no trace you can point to in the moment it is happening. Only later, when you look at what has changed shape, do you see that something was there. What the Army recorded from August 2007 at Fort Jackson. Drill Sergeant Marcus Webb was treated on August 14th for heat exhaustion and moderate dehydration, following a field navigation training exercise. He was cleared to return to limited duty on August 16th, and returned to full training duty on August 17th. He completed the current training cycle without further medical incident. His performance evaluation for the cycle was rated excellent. Corporal candidate Alicia Renner was formally cited on August 17th by the Fort Jackson Post Safety Officer for a correct and timely invocation of verbal safety protocol under Army Regulation 385-10 during active training operations. The citation noted that the invocation was procedurally sound, documented through the appropriate post-incident reporting channel, and executed without disruption to training continuity. A positive citation, evidence that something had been done correctly. It was the only official document in existence that acknowledged, in any form, what had happened on the gravel lot that first Thursday morning. Webb's medical record listed Renner among the responding personnel, in the clinical shorthand that medical records use for people who are supporting variables in a physiological event, rather than people who made choices under pressure. Her name appeared as assisting personnel, which was accurate and which captured nothing meaningful about what assisting had looked like in that wood line. The form was not designed to hold what had happened. Nobody had been negligent in its design. It was simply built to record a different kind of thing. The training cycle ended in late August. The recruits dispersed to their next assignments. Most of them would not see each other again for years, and some of them would not see each other again at all, which is the nature of the military and of life more generally. But they carried with them what they had seen, each in their own way, each weighted toward the particular detail that had most lodged itself in them. Gary Oakes carried the expression on Webb's face in the moment before he stepped away. Helen Ford carried the phrase, and the precision of it, and what it meant that someone had prepared it. Patrick Lowes carried the step itself, and the absence of explanation attached to it. Sophie Grant carried the 11 minutes in the wood line and the particular quality of Renner's voice throughout them. Alicia Renner carried the 3 seconds. None of them talked about it much in those first years. Not because it was secret. There was nothing secret about it. But stories need context to be told correctly, and the context for this one was not yet available. The people who had been there understood it. The people who had not been there kept hearing something different from what they were trying to say. so they carried it. Time moved. The way time moves in the military, by cycle, and by assignment, and by the accumulation of years that look individually unremarkable, and are only distinguishable in the shape they leave on the person living through them. Renner was promoted through the enlisted ranks, and then applied for, and was selected for, officer candidate school. She was commissioned as a second lieutenant. She deployed to Germany in a logistics support capacity and returned. She completed her undergraduate degree while on active duty, a habit she had built of treating every available resource as something to use rather than defer. She made first lieutenant, then captain. She was 30 years old when she pinned on the railroad tracks and was assigned to Fort Meade, Maryland, in a logistics coordination role that suited her in the specific way that roles suit people whose primary skill is managing complex information under conditions that do not particularly favor patience. She was good at her job. She was good at it in the way she had always been good at the things she decided to take seriously, which was methodically and without display. She did not talk about August 2007. Marcus Webb finished the training cycle and ran the next one and the one after that. He remained on post at Fort Jackson for 3 more years before his next assignment, and was, throughout that time, regarded as one of the most effective drill instructors in the command. His evaluations reflected this consistently. The recruits who passed through his cycles carried that effectiveness forward in the way that good teaching is always carried forward, invisibly, in the performance of people who do not realize they learned something from a specific person until much later, when they find themselves doing it right. He also, in a way that no one documented, and that most people on the post did not consciously register as a change, ran every safety protocol by the book, every step, every checklist item in its correct sequence. The people who had been in that gravel lot on that Thursday morning in August noticed, each time they interacted with him in the years that followed, that something about the way he ran his protocols had shifted. It was subtle. It might have been invisible to anyone who had not been standing there watching him the morning it changed. It was not invisible to them. The years moved. Renner made captain. Webb completed his time at Fort Jackson and was reassigned. Both of them moved through the world that the Army was, carrying what they carried, the way people do. Then, on a Thursday evening in October, 11 years and 2 months after the gravel lot, Alicia Renner's phone rang with a South Carolina area code she did not recognize, and she answered it. The voice took her 3 seconds to place. She was normally fast with voices. It took 3 seconds because she had not heard this one in 11 years, and because the years had added something to it she did not have a clean word for, something that was not simply age. "Captain Renner," Marcus Webb said. She sat down at her kitchen table. "Sergeant Webb," she said. There was a silence between them that was full rather than empty, the silence of 2 people standing on either side of something that has not been said yet, and both of them knowing what it is. "I have been looking for you for 3 years," he said. She did not fill that. "I found your record through a mutual contact at Fort Meade. I hope that is all right." "It is," she said. Another pause. "I owe you 2 things," he said. "I have spent a long time trying to figure out the right order to say them, and the right words to use, and I have decided there is no right version, so I am going to say them plainly." "Go ahead," she said. "The first is that you were right. In the gravel lot, the regulation, the protocol, the specific language of the invocation, every part of it, you were correct, and I knew you were correct in the moment you said it, and the proper response to a correct safety invocation from any personnel is immediate compliance, which I gave you, but I should have also formally and verbally acknowledged the correctness of your invocation to you at the time. I did not do that. I moved away from the equipment and continued the morning, and I left you standing there with no acknowledgement of any kind. That was a failure on my part, and I have no explanation for it that I would consider adequate." She was quiet for a moment. "I understood why you did not," she said. "That does not change what I should have done. You do not have to make this comfortable for me. I am not calling for comfort." She almost smiled. "Go ahead to the second thing," she said. "The second thing is about the wood line," he said. "About what you said when you came up beside me." She waited. "You said my name," he said. "My first name, not my rank, not drill sergeant, my name. And you said you had it, and I could stay right there." He paused. I have spent 11 years thinking about why you did that. After everything. Given the position I was in relative to you and the position you were in relative to me, given that you had no particular reason, by any measure I could point to extend that to me, I have thought about what it means that you did. She sat with that for a moment. You were a person who needed help, she said, finally. That was the whole reason. There was no other reason. I know, he said. That is the part I have been sitting with. The phone call lasted 40 minutes. It was not comfortable all the way through. There were parts where the conversation entered territory that was complicated and stayed there, because some things are complicated, and the honest way to handle them is to stay in the complication, rather than find a route to somewhere easier. Webb said things that were difficult to say. He said them anyway. Renner said things that were true, and did not try to soften them into something more manageable. At the end, there was a silence that was different from the silences before it in the call. The silence of two people who have walked through something together, and come out on the other side, in a place that is not the same as where they began. I am glad you called, she said. I am glad you answered, he said. She sat in her kitchen in Maryland after the call ended, and thought about the 3 seconds. Not the call. Not the 11 years. The 3 seconds before she stepped out of the 4th row, when she had looked at both sides of the ledger, and made the choice that had been sitting in her ever since. She had not expected to spend 11 years thinking about 3 seconds. She sat with it for a while. Then she made tea and went to bed. The letter from the Army Safety Council arrived 6 weeks before Webb called. She read it twice and set it on the corner of her desk, in the place where things went when she needed them to stay visible while she worked out what to do with them. The letter invited Captain Alicia Renner to submit a proposal for a keynote address at the 2022 Annual Safety Leadership Conference, to be held in Washington in February of the following year. She was not, by any honest accounting, a public speaker. This was not false modesty, which she had no use for in any situation. It was an accurate professional self-assessment. She was excellent in rooms where language was a precision tool, and the goal was a specific, measurable outcome. She was substantially less comfortable in rooms where the language itself was the point, where the purpose was to move people rather than inform them, where success was measured in something other than whether the task got done correctly. The letter sat on the corner of her desk for 9 days. On the 10th day, Webb called. She accepted the invitation the following morning, before she had decided why she was accepting it, in the way that decisions sometimes arrive before their reasoning does. She spent 2 months writing the address. She revised it more times and more fundamentally than she had ever revised any document in her professional life, which was saying something, because she was not a person who produced sloppy first drafts. But the other documents she had written in her career had a clearer standard. They were correct or they were not, and the process of revision was the process of finding and correcting the errors. This document had a different and more difficult standard. It needed to be true, which is not the same as being correct. And truth does not tell you when you have reached it the way correctness does. Every draft she produced, she wrote through the gravel lot, and the heat, and the regulation, and the exchange, and the step away, and the wood line, and the years after, and the phone call. She wrote all of it with the precision and specificity she brought to everything important, and every time she arrived at the 3 seconds before the step, she moved past them in a way that made them feel like a brief and essentially resolved preliminary, a moment of calculation that had come out clearly in one direction, and then led to the action that followed. It was only in the last draft, written 5 days before the conference at her kitchen table at 11 at night, that she stopped in the middle of that section and understood what was wrong with every version she had written before it. She had been writing about what she chose. She had not written about how close she had come to not choosing it. She deleted the ending she had. She sat with the blank space on the screen, and the cold coffee at her elbow, and she looked honestly at what it would cost her to say the true version in a room of 600 people. What it would cost her was the version of herself that this story had given her over the last 15 years. The version that had moved without hesitation. The version that was the kind of person for whom the right answer was clear, and the movement toward it was natural. That version existed in other people's memories, and other people's accounts. It was a version people had drawn something real from. It had meaning. It was not entirely true. The true version had stood in the fourth row of that formation for 3 seconds, with genuine weight on both sides of a genuine choice, and had been honestly, meaningfully, not by a wide margin, close to staying right where she was. She started writing the true version. The address ran 15 minutes. She had been asked to speak for 20, and had chosen to use 15, not from any false humility, but from the understanding that the thing you want a room to carry home needs silence after it. Filling that silence with more words is not the same as giving the room something to take. She spent the first 2/3 of the address exactly as she had rehearsed. Specific, flat, factual. The regulation, the training cycle, the deviation, the invocation, the step away, the wood line and the pine needles and the medical record that listed her as assisting personnel, the phone call 11 years later, the citation that said correct and timely and nothing else. She spoke about what the official record captured and what it did not, and she treated both with equal respect, because the record was what it was designed to be, and the thing it did not capture simply was not what records are for. Then she stopped. The room settled into a different kind of quiet. She said, "I want to tell you about the 3 seconds before I stepped out." She told them. Not the version she had rehearsed for 15 years, in which the 3 seconds were a calculation that resolved cleanly in the right direction. The real version. She stood at the front of the room in Washington and described, in the same flat and specific language she had used for everything else, what those 3 seconds had actually felt like, the weight on both sides, the version of herself that stayed still, how close that version had come to being the one that happened. She told them that the story they might have heard, the one in which she stepped out without hesitation because the right answer was obvious, was not the true story. She told them she had been very close to staying still. And she told them she was saying this because she believed it was the most important part of the story, and she had not said it to anyone, in any room, before today. Because if the story was about a person who stepped out easily, for whom the right answer was clear and the path to it was unobstructed, then the story had a limited use. It was the story of a particular kind of person in a particular kind of moment, and the room could take what applied to them and set aside the rest under experiences they personally did not have. But if the story was about 3 seconds in which the right thing and the easier thing were genuinely in competition with each other, and the right thing won by a margin she had not been willing to admit until this room, then the story was about everyone present, because everyone in that room had been in a moment with weight on both sides. Everyone had felt the specific pull of the easier option. Everyone had spent time in the 3 seconds. The question, she said, was never whether you were the kind of person for whom stepping out was natural and uncomplicated. The question was whether, in 3 seconds of genuine and uncomfortable uncertainty, you moved. She finished the sentence. She did not add anything to it. The room was quiet for longer than rooms are quiet after a keynote address ends. Then it was not quiet. She stood at the front and let it come toward her, and she stayed where she was, which was what she had always done. In the months that followed, she received more correspondence than she had received across the rest of her professional life combined. Letters from officers at every level, messages from enlisted personnel who had found the recording through the internal network, from a captain in Texas who said the 3 seconds part had made her, that same afternoon, do something she had been avoiding for 4 months, from a sergeant major in Germany who had listened to the address 3 times in one evening and then written a letter to a person he had not spoken to in 8 years, from a young corporal at Fort Bragg who wrote a single paragraph saying she had been in the 3 seconds last week, about something small, and she had not moved, and she was writing because she wanted someone to know she was aware of it and intended to handle it differently. She read every letter. She gave the address again in June, at Fort Bragg, and in September, at the Officer Leadership Symposium, and both times, she kept the 3 seconds exactly as she had said them the first time, without softening and without elaboration. Each time, the room went into that particular silence. Each time, someone found her afterward. Not to tell her she was brave, not to say it was inspiring, which is a word that creates comfortable distance between the person who says it and the thing being described. They came to tell her they had been in the 3 seconds too. That was what stayed with her, across all the letters and all the rooms and all the cold cups of coffee at kitchen tables in the hours before sleep. Not that she had moved, that so many people had been standing in the same 3 seconds, in their own heat, on their own gravel, with the weight on both sides and the easier option right there, available and reasonable, and not even clearly wrong from any external view. She thought about Marcus Webb stepping away from the equipment without explanation. She thought about how she had not expected that. She had prepared for the argument, and he had done the right thing, and he had done it without performance, and without anyone officially noting that it had been a choice, rather than a simple compliance, because there was no form for that. There was a form for the invocation. There was no form for the step away. She understood now, in a way she had not understood when she was 29 and sitting in her kitchen after the call, that what had sat in the complicated place inside her for 11 years was not confusion about what he had done. It was recognition. He had also been in the 3 seconds. He had been standing in a moment with weight on both sides. More weight in some ways than she had been carrying. The weight of 11 years and 400 eyes, and an identity built, over more than a decade, on being the person who does not step away from anything, who is not moved or corrected or redirected by anyone beneath him in the chain of command. And he had stepped away. Without announcement, without credit, without anyone writing it down as a choice. She opened a new document one evening in November, and began to write something that was not the address, and not a letter, and not any professional document. She wrote about the days before the gravel lot, when she was 21 years old and sitting across a desk from a compliance officer at a contractor's office, reading her way through a thick binder of safety regulations and making the first slow decisions of her working life about what kind of person she intended to be and what kind of weight she was willing to carry. She wrote it for herself, not for any room. She wrote it because she was beginning to understand that the story she had been telling, the one that began on the gravel lot in August 2007, had actually begun before that, in the small choices that precede the large ones. In every 3-second window that is too brief to be called courage but is, in the accumulation of all of them together, the material a person is built from. She wrote until the kitchen was dark and the November night was pressing cold against the window, and the document on the screen was longer than she had meant it to be. She saved it, and closed the laptop and washed the cup and went to bed. The document sat in a folder on her computer for 2 years before she did anything with it. Then she did something with it. But that is a different story, and this one ends here, in the place all stories of this kind actually end, not at the moment of action, not at the public acknowledgement, not at the conference or the phone call or the citation in the official record. It ends in the 3 seconds, in the heat, on the gravel, with the weight on both sides of the ledger and both options genuinely available. 3 seconds, the place where every real decision is actually made. The place that no form has ever been designed to capture, and no record has ever successfully held, and no one standing outside those 3 seconds can fully see from where they are standing. The place that belongs entirely to the person inside it. 3 seconds, deciding.